It's a region Russia regards as its own backyard, but the European Union may be looking to strengthen its influence in Central Asia. The EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, recently met regional leaders in Tajikistan and stressed their strategic importance to Europe. Around the same time, Vladimir Putin hosted a similar gathering in Russia. But with the distraction of the conflict in Ukraine, is he losing his grip on a traditional sphere of influence? And what can European leaders offer instead? Welcome to Roundtable. I'm Hazem Seeker. Well, some are suggesting Russia's influence in Central Asia is waning as Ukraine demands Moscow's attention and resources. Extending from the Caspian Sea to the west to the border of China in the east, Central Asia has historically been a strategic trade route and prized by various powers over the centuries. Russia has long been the main economic and military power in the region, taking on the responsibility of maintaining stability. But is there a new opportunity for the US and the European Union because of the potential power vacuum? Is a new political great game brewing in Central Asia? Well, joining our discussion now from Washington, D.C., Paul Stroski is a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. From Tbilisi in Georgia, we have Emil Avdaliani, Director of Middle East Studies at the Georgian think tank Geocas. And joining us from Prague in the Czech Republic, Bruce Panier. He is a journalist and political analyst of Central Asian affairs. Good to have you all with us. Paul, if I could start with you then, and we'll start with that question that we posed at the top of the program. Is Russia losing its grip on this traditional sphere of influence?
I would say losing its grip is a bit of a strong word. What I think we are seeing is that the war in Ukraine has alienated many Central Asian states. It has raised questions about the reliance of Russia as an economic and security partner. I think the region looks at the performance of the Russian military in Central Asia and has clear questions about Russia's reliability as a military. And then I think the economic impacts are also hurting the region. So what we are seeing is we're certainly seeing Russia's influence weakening, but it's not yet clear that it's losing its entire grip on the region.
Emil Avdaliani, how do you see Russia's position in Central Asia right now, particularly with the conflict in Ukraine?
Well, I think to add to what Paul already said, I think the war in Ukraine gave Central Asian states more flexibility in a way. So Russia is preoccupied elsewhere. It certainly has seen its position weakened over the past year, and it certainly does give Kazakhstan and others, but primarily Kazakhstan, sort of bigger room for maneuver with other players. So diversification of foreign policy, that's the problem and the ultimate goal of every Central Asian state. And I think that's what Kazakhstan and other Central Asian states are trying to achieve. And with Russia, as I said, preoccupied in Ukraine, it now has those countries now have bigger room for maneuver, bigger space for Turkey, China, and other actors to play more active role in Central Asia.
Bruce Panier, is that how you see it? That this is a window of opportunity for the European Union and other Western nations?
Well, definitely. Actually, what they probably do is build on some of the progress that they already made in the region over the years. Having Russia, perhaps not a stable partner, at least as a constant. And so all of a sudden, when you have these problems with Russia, it's an opportunity for some of these other countries who have always been there, but kind of been a little bit on the sidelines. So European Union being one, but there's certainly some others that are in there too. That now the Central Asian Sea relationships with these countries as being far more attractive going forward into the future, understanding that their situation vis-a-vis Russia is changing to the detriment of the status quo as it's been for 30 years.
Well, the EU's top diplomat, Josep Borrell, has been in the region, as we were saying at the top there, and he's been speaking about the purpose of all this. And we're going to show a clip now of some of what he said.
Our purpose is to bring closer Europe and Central Asia. To bring closer, using what we call Team Europe, which is a consolidated action of the member states of the European Union, its institutions, and our financial capacities. We offer, Minister, our extended hand to the Central Asian partners to build on our strategy for Central Asia, to deepen our links, to expand cooperation, and to work together to ensure a sustainable development and economic prosperity in the future.
Paul Stroski, if I could turn back to you on this.
Sure.
What are the EU's aims here at this point? Are they largely economic, and is there a sense that they don't want to kind of overstep their bounds, knowing the historical ties that many of these Central Asian states still have with Russia?
Well, I think Europe has always been wary about overstepping its bounds when it comes to Central Asia. It traditionally has looked at Central Asia differently than other parts of the former Soviet Union, and as almost a separate region. Central Asia, for example, is not part of the Eastern Partnership. What I think today, what we're seeing is as Europe seeks to delink itself from Russian infrastructure, from Russian energy supplies, from the vast amount of cargo that traditionally has traveled across Russia from Asia. They're increasingly looking at Central Asia as an alternative. I also think that the Europeans recognize that the war in Ukraine is bringing some economic hardship to the region. It's certainly, as I said, it's disrupted supply chains. It's made doing transactions globally more challenging. And this is a region where there's tremendous amounts of poverty and a need for more sustainable economic growth. So I think Europe, there is certainly an economic aspect to this, but I think the economic outreach is also to try to help enhance the stability of this region, so we don't see further disruptions in the broad Eurasian landmass.
Let's continue on the trade and investment track here. We're going to put up a graphic now that shows the kind of level of trade and investment that the EU has in Central Asia. This chart gives us a sense of Europe's level of engagement in the region before the conflict in Ukraine. In 2017, the European Parliament said the EU was Central Asia's main trade partner, followed by China and Russia. Europe also important for foreign investment. In Kazakhstan, for example, the EU is by far the largest foreign investor with 57%. So it just gives you an idea there of what's at stake for the European Union. Bruce Panier, if I could turn to you on this, how has this strengthening of economic ties, do you think, been received by leaders in the region? And is this European, to what extent is this European investment welcomed?
Well, I think it's very welcome. The one thing I have to say right away about EU investment and financing in Central Asia is it doesn't leave a trail of debt, which a lot of other countries can't say. Comparing it to China, for instance, which has invested a lot of money, but also left the Central Asians with some huge debts that in some cases they won't be able to pay back. The European Union has not done that. They've been a constant investor, but in the meantime, their projects are built at helping infrastructure, for instance. And when they're completed, like I said, the Central Asians don't find themselves on the hook for funds that they took that they're going to have to spend years paying back. So that's a welcome contribution from the European Union too. And I think it also helps too, if I could just mention for a second, that the European Union has kind of a different relationship with Central Asia than some of the other players that are trying to get influence in Central Asia, in the fact that it is a group of countries and it approaches Central Asia, as Paul said, as a region too. Not that it recognizes there are 5 individual states in Central Asia, but it also approaches Central Asia regionally, and the European Union itself is a regional organization. So there's a different dynamic between EU Central Asian relations than, say, Central Asia's relationship with Russia or the United States or China or India.
Emil Avdaliani, I mean, we've been talking up to this point about all of these Central Asian states, former Soviet states, as kind of one grouping. But they are certainly not a monolith. They are all looking out for their own interests, essentially, aren't they? Are these? To what extent do they have? To what extent do we see their differences in terms of each of their needs since the conflict in Ukraine began?
Yes, well, certainly. Each Central Asian state has its own and very much different, at times very much different, foreign policy objectives. But I would say that looking at the region from a broader perspective, the region and all the 5 countries, they seek diversification of their foreign ties. Ultimately, the ideal scenario for them is to avoid being even a part of a Sino-Russian condominium. But they seek more congested geopolitical space with EU and other actors playing, more active part in the region. And in that part, I think what EU does is crucial. I wouldn't say that those measures taken over the past year, they suffice to change the balance, status quo in the region, but it's certain sort of laying the ground, because in the longer term, I think the trend is quite obvious. The EU needs to have sort of a land connection. I would say circumventing Russia with Central Asia, and that's primarily going through South Caucasus. And if we see EU Central Asian relations not only as EU Central Asian relations, but essentially also as a part of EU South Caucasus relations, we see there is a sort of a dynamic there, sort of building a corridor essentially, which was already present before the war in Ukraine, I mean the second invasion of Ukraine, but now we sort of see intensification of this expansion of this corridor. And I think EU's ties with Georgia and Azerbaijan speak volumes about that. So the expansion and building sort of a corridor which will be circumventing Russian heartland essentially.
And just to expand on this in a little bit more detail with you, Emil, what are some of the most glaring examples of Russia's waning influence in Central Asia? I mean, we've seen more conflicts in the region over the last few months, haven't we?
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Well, I think major problem Russia has been facing over the past year, that's the declining geopolitical prestige. And I would say that Russian multilateralism is also experiencing serious troubles. That CSTO, problems within Eurasian Economic Union, and I would say that, but surely not to exaggerate, but there are signs that China is trying to build, sort of advance its own multilateral organization. It has been doing this before for decades. I mean, with Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. But over the past year, there has been more, I would say, bigger room for China to advance its own institutions and sort of to maybe, if not entirely eclipse Russian variants, but certainly sort of diminish its impact on Central Asian states.
Paul Stroski, how do you see Russia responding to this in the long term? Because it does still remain very influential in Central Asia, doesn't it? I mean, just to use one example, Tajikistan, which is a small country that neighbors China and Afghanistan. It's heavily dependent on labor migration. There are a lot of Tajiks who live and work in Russia and send money back to their families back home. So that is certainly an area of leverage that Russia still has, isn't it?
Certainly, that is one area of leverage. These migrant laborers. Many thought that the migrant laborers would start coming home in greater numbers. We have not seen that in huge numbers during the war. We have not seen a huge decline in remittances coming from Russia to Central Asia. Although some of these numbers could be skewed, since we've seen a lot of Russians flee from Russia itself to Central Asia, bringing their money with them. So I also would argue, Russia has a lot of ability to cause problems in the region. It has military facilities in two of the countries, and actually close military ties with Kazakhstan, a long undefended border with Kazakhstan. So there are certainly those avenues where it can certainly exert pressure. And then, it does have all of these multilateral Russian-dominated organizations. Russia has been activating them. We've seen high levels of Russian diplomacy over the last year with Central Asia. We've seen sort of a more lukewarm reception, but Central Asians are very good at showing this, at engaging on the symbolism of diplomacy, even if they're not fully in alignment and in agreement with everything Russia is doing.
Yeah, I mean, interesting you mentioned the symbolism there. There was this clip that's been doing the rounds on social media quite a lot of President Putin at one of these meetings being kept waiting by one of those Central Asian leaders. And Bruce, if I could put this to you, I mean, as journalists, we love to kind of read into things like that, whether that was a coincidence or whether it was deliberate or not. But it does sort of strengthen a certain narrative, doesn't it, about Russia's waning influence in that region and how the Central Asian nations treat Russia.
Well, yeah, it's actually been more than one president from Central Asia that's kept Putin waiting. I guess you could say that they're paying him back in his own coin, since he's kept them waiting on many occasions. So there's a little bit, I suppose, a hint of some revenge there. I think another one of the problems that we haven't mentioned so far yet is Russia's chauvinist attitude. Leading up to the conflict in Ukraine and since it started. There have been some threatening statements made about Kazakhstan, that Russia, that it was never a country, that Russia settled it, most of it or all of it. There's been Russian officials, including the Russian president, who have mentioned that they consider the former territory of the Soviet Union to essentially be historic Russian lands. These kind of statements send a chill down the backs of the Central Asian leaders. So naturally, when they are actually face to face with Putin, they want to do something to show their discontent with and honestly a little bit of fear that these statements are still being made, and of course at the same time that we're hearing these chauvinist statements come out of Russia, there's been more than 1 million Russian citizens who have passed through Central Asia since the end of February last year. Most kept going to a third country, but that's one of the biggest migrations of people through Central Asia, possibly in history. And the Central Asians see this and understand that this is a sign of a weakening Russia.
And Bruce, is pragmatism and hedging ultimately the name of the game here for these Central Asian states? Because we can talk a lot about whether they're seen as moving closer to the West or China and so on, but ultimately these countries are going to pursue policies like everybody else that are in their own interests.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, definitely, and and I think Paul had it right at the start when he said, Russia's influence. It's hard to imagine you could uproot all of Russia's influence from Central Asia. They've been there for 150 years, in some cases even longer than that. So the Central Asians, of course, are hedging their bets. No one knows how the Ukrainian conflict is going to end. No one knows what Russia's going to look like when it does end. But this is an opportunity for the Central Asians to really diversify their foreign policies. I mean, they've been talking about this multi-vector foreign policy for years, building strong relations with all kinds of other countries. So I think the Central Asia that will emerge after the war in Ukraine is over will be one that's far less dependent upon Russia and really probably less afraid of Russia.
Is that how you see it, Emil?
Yes, I think we are really going to see sort of a much different Central Asia-Russia relations following the end of the war in Ukraine. But as the conflict continues, the dynamic, we are certainly, there are lots of uncertainties around the war in Ukraine, how it's going to end and so on and so on. But I think the longer the conflict continues, bigger opportunities emerge for Central Asian states. And again, to argue that Russia will be entirely uprooted from the region in terms of its military, economic influence, that surely is not going to happen. But what Central Asian states really want, that's sort of even a slight diminution of Russian influence, which will be giving them a bigger room for maneuver.
Paul Stroski, how do you think some of the other major powers will be looking at this? I know you mentioned China earlier, but if we look beyond that, if we look at India and the Gulf states and so on, how will they be looking at this?
Well, I think many of these other states see this as an opportunity. The Gulf states, India, Turkey, I would even argue Korea and Japan, have all been, as Bruce said, on the margins of Central Asia. They've been engaged economically. Some of them have been engaged militarily in the security front. And I think this really enhances their clout. It makes them more attractive. And many of these countries, they treat Central Asia on more equal terms. They recognize a Central Asian agency. I think that's something that Russia does not recognize. Russia has not recognized that this is a region that has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. These other countries, which are more new entrants, post-Soviet entrants into the region, I think may have a better understanding of how this region is evolving than many in Russia do. So I certainly think, it is, it's not just the Europeans and not just China and not just the United States we need to be looking at, but I certainly expect India, I expect the Gulf states, certainly Turkey, to really be very attractive partners for the Central Asian states, and I think we'll see a lot of engagement and possibly increased influence of these powers as well.
Bruce Panier, just in the few minutes that we've got left here, how do you see this playing out then in Central Asia? The longer the conflict in Ukraine goes on and Russia is seen as kind of asleep at the wheel in Central Asia?
Well, the more that Central Asia can build economic trade relations and security relations with some of these other countries that they, previously they've known but not really been closely involved with, the more it changes the geopolitical situation in Central Asia. The Central Asians reassess their foreign policy needs. if Russia cannot provide all the security guarantees that it has in the past, and they're able to get those from other countries, and they're satisfied that they fulfilled those needs, then of course the relationship changes with Russia. The same goes with trade. So that's certainly going to change. And I think another thing with that, we'd heard Emil had mentioned the corridors, right? The trade corridors that are going on. Central Asia, for once, benefits. For years, they've been portraying themselves and advertising themselves as the crossroads of the Eurasian continent. Well, China wants to trade with Europe, and they don't want to have to depend on Russia to do it. So it's in both Europe and China's interest to develop Central Asia's trade networks, which the Central Asians, of course, will also benefit from too. And again, when 5 or 6 years pass down the road, and China and Europe are conducting most of their trade through Central Asia, that will also be reason for a reassessment of exactly what they get out of a relationship with Russia and what level they want to continue to engage with Russia, and certainly in terms of trade, investment, things like that.
Thank you for that. And on that, we are going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Paul Stroski, Emil Avdaliani, and Bruce Panier. Thanks very much for being on Roundtable.
Thank you.
And remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thanks for watching.